What's up guys, welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to be talking a little bit about the two main options for professional grading in Yu-Gi-Oh, which are PSA and Beckett or BGS. There are already a couple of videos out there on this topic, but I felt that they were all a bit out of date and didn't go through all the information available. So I wanted to make this video to put everything in one place so that if you're deciding to send some cards off for professional grading for the first time, you have all the information at your fingertips that you might want to make that decision. Okay, and before I go into more detail about how the two companies handle the grading process, I'm first just going to do a quick demonstration of how the two cases look side by side. So this is a PSA case on the left and a Beckett case on the right. The dimensions of the two cases are pretty similar. PSA is ever so slightly longer than BGS, and the BGS case is heavier and a little thicker than the PSA case as well. Now, in terms of which case looks better, I think that's largely subjective, so I'm not going to talk about it too much in this video. But the one thing to note is that since BGS cases do include an inner sleeve that the card is in, there is an extra layer of plastic, and you do sometimes get a kind of warping on that sleeve. So when you're looking at the card in the light, it doesn't necessarily look as clean as a PSA case. However, in terms of actually looking at the card head on, the sleeve doesn't really show up, and I would say both cases are roughly equal. Now, moving on to the two scales that the different companies use. PSA grades cards on a 10-point scale, going from 1, which is considered poor, to 10, which is considered gem mint. Now, a gem mint card from PSA does not mean a flawless card, but it means a card which in theory only has one or two extremely minor flaws which do not detract from the eye appeal of the card, and which is centered within a ratio of 60-40 on the front and 75-25 on the back. And the Beckett scale also ranges from 1 to 10, but it has 0.5 grades as well. So you can get a 1.5 or a 5.5, or as you see here, a 9.5. And the other thing to note about Beckett is that they award subgrades to your card, and that's how the overall grade is determined. So this here is what you would call a basic Beckett 9.5, because it has a 9 on centering and then 3 9.5s, which is the minimum requirement to meet the overall grade of Gem Mint from Beckett. And because 9.5 is considered Gem Mint from Beckett, the grade above that, which is a 10, has a different name, and that's called Pristine. Now, PSA has always been the more popular option for grading Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and I'm going to run through a few of the reasons for that now. I think the first one is because their scale runs from 1 to 10, and 10 is Gem Mint, collectors prefer the fact that they can get a matching set of 10s for their collection, whereas with Beckett, because they demand such a high standard for a pristine card, you have to settle for 9.5, which doesn't have as clean a look to it. And it's the same way with the cases. I think most people think that the PSA case looks a little cleaner, a little better aesthetically than the BGS case. And so a lot of collectors are drawn to PSA on those kinds of grounds. Now, if we're talking about other advantages that PSA has, one thing I would say is the fact that they use qualifiers with grades. So a card normally to get a mint 9 has to be centered within still a reasonably good ratio, not as high as a PSA 10, but it can't be way OC. However, if a card is miscut or extremely off-center, PSA can actually still award the grade mint 9, and they'll just put the qualifier OC or MC next to the number. Now, Beckett does not offer that option. If your card is miscut, it can get anything as low as a 1 on centering, which can drag the overall grade down a huge amount. So those are a couple of advantages of PSA. Now, if we switch back to Beckett and discuss the advantages there, there's a lot more detail in the Beckett grading system because of the fact that they award subgrades to the card. Now, I'm not talking about the subjectivity of the grading right now. That's not necessarily reduced by having subgrades. However, it means that you can award something like a weaker Gem Mint grade, which this Mystical Elf is an example of, since the centering is quite shifted left to right, and even a little bit top to bottom. Now, if you send this card to PSA, you could expect either a 9 or a 10, but it's kind of hard to tell because that card is right on the borderline of what is considered acceptable for a PSA 10. Whereas at Beckett, you could probably pretty consistently get this exact same grade with that 9 on centering, and all the other subgrades being gem mint. So that also means that you have variation within the same grade. So this is a basic 9.5 Mystical Elf, but this here is a quad plus plus Des Volsc Elf. What that means is that all of the subgrades are at least 9.5, and 2 of them are actually 10. So if this card was 0.5 higher, it would be awarded the overall grade of Pristine. But even as it is, you can differentiate as a collector between these two cards, and you know when you're buying the card that this one on the right will be a lot higher quality than this card on the left. And one last point that I don't really have a great demonstration of here with me at the moment is that Beckett is much more willing to label things like misprints and variants on cards than PSA. So PSA is extremely conservative with what they agree to label. It's pretty recent that they even agreed to label, for example, ultimate rares as distinct from the regular rarity in GX, which is something that Beckett has done right from the start of grading Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And they're also willing to label things like, for example, the gold letter misprints for Trihunt Dragon and Gaia the Dragon Champion. All those sorts of errors, Beckett is happy to put on the label. And so it makes them a lot more popular with misprint collectors, because they can actually have their card slapped up as what it is. Now, collectors often argue about which company is more consistent in the grades they award. But I don't think it's a simple question as, is PSA or Beckett more consistent? I think there's a lot more complexity to the argument than that. So I would say where PSA wins is for any grade below a mint 9. And the reason I say that is that Beckett's subgrade system is very unclear in terms of the standards they expect to get an 8 or an 8.5 or 7.5 or 7. Whereas since PSA only has 10 overall grades to worry about and no subgrades, I think they do a better job of getting the 6s, the 7s, and the 8s better differentiated from each other. So this card on the right here is a Blue Eyes White Dragon first edition from LOB, and I graded this card myself. Now when I sent the card in, I had expected it to grade something like a 7.5 to an 8. And the reason for that is that the card, as you can probably see, has a significant amount of whitening around the back edges and also a lot of scratching on the back surface. But in the end, this card graded within 0.5 of a 9, which in my opinion is too high. And it's a trend I see pretty frequently with BGS cards below a 9, that the subgrades are much harder to trust than when the card is graded a 9 or higher overall. So yeah, I think PSA actually does a better job for those lower grades, but I think that the situation completely changes when you get above a 9. So there are a lot of PSA 10 Yu-Gi-Oh cards specifically out there, which have pretty significant defects, lots of whitening, for example, on the back edges, sometimes extremely poor centering that should not be permitted to be gem mint, and other defects like that. Whereas with BGS, when you deal with a 9.5, the only issue I would say you see commonly on those cards is that the centering is awarded a 9 and it deserves lower than a 9. It's pretty rare to see a Beckett 9.5 which has significant edge wear, corner wear, or anything like that. Now, in the last 12 months specifically, there's been a lot of dissatisfaction expressed by Yu-Gi-Oh collectors about PSA. And I'm going to run through the reasons for that now. So one thing which I think is probably more important than anything else is that in the last 12 months or so, PSA have been damaging a worryingly high proportion of cards. So I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but certainly I've had people send off submissions and come back with as high as 10% of their cards featuring some kind of damage, often something as bad as a pressure line or a crease, or even like a fingernail indent at the top. So that kind of thing obviously is extremely off-putting for any collector to submit cards for professional grading. As of me making this video, it is not something that PSA has fixed. There is still regular damage happening on cards which are submitted to them. And so I would say that in the current environment, that is a big reason not to send to PSA, because I have not seen anything like the same degree of damage caused by BGS on the whole. And the other thing that people are concerned with PSA, especially in recent times, is the consistency of their grading. And this seems to be something that varies a lot. Some subs come back absolutely fine, but you do definitely see PSA subs at the moment where cards which seem to be in that 9 to 10 range for condition come back with grades like 6s and 5s. So again, it's something that PSA can fix, and I really hope they do fix it. But in the current environment, it's a big reason either why not to send to PSA, or at least to hold off sending until they listen to the complaints and start to fix something. Oh, and one last thing I should mention in terms of dissatisfaction with PSA is that PSA have graded a lot of counterfeit Yu-Gi-Oh cards over the years as authentic, especially with those infamous redback LOB fakes and counterfeit GBI God cards as well. It's something they got a bit better at more recently, but even this year and last year, I've seen a handful of counterfeit LOB non-holos graded as 9s and 10s by PSA, so it is still something that they need to address. And I think it's also something which hurts their brand reputation in Yu-Gi-Oh a lot, because they've graded so many of them already. Now, moving on to Beckett, they don't have any of the same problems that PSA has had in terms of grading counterfeits or damaging cards on a significant scale. However, there are still a lot of complaints raised about Beckett. One, which is very relevant at the moment, and it's quite a recent thing, is that Beckett have started attributing glossy and wavy on the labels for their LOB cards. And of course, sometimes they get it right, like with this glossy print Blue Eyes, but they've also got it wrong a lot. And that's driving collectors who send LOB to Beckett just up the wall at the moment. So that's absolutely something they need to fix, and hopefully they will do that soon. But the other thing which I've had a couple of people talk to me about recently is that they have also been experiencing a lot of inconsistency in the grades they get from Beckett. Now, I actually just got back the results of a sub myself the other day, and the grades were nothing like what I expected on the whole. So I don't know if it's down to the whole global situation at the moment, fewer staff, things like that. But I think at the moment you can't expect a particularly high standard of consistency from Beckett either. So I think that pretty much does it in terms of running through the different pros and cons of PSA and Beckett, kind of comparing them to each other. One thing I haven't mentioned, which I suppose is important, is that PSA on the whole is a little cheaper than Beckett. Now, you can grade with Beckett more cheaply than the regular service if you choose to grade without subgrades, which is something they offer. But on the whole, that's very unpopular with collectors to grade with Beckett without getting the subgrades, and so it's not something I'd really recommend. Now, in terms of what I prefer myself between the two companies, I definitely lean in favor of Beckett. And the reason for that is that for my own collection, I'm only ever interested in getting gem mint grades. And as I stated earlier in the video, Beckett is worse with grades below a 9, but with grades from 9.5 and above, I would say from all my experience over the years that they have a much greater consistency of awarding those grades to cards which actually deserve them. And especially if you deal with the absolute highest grades they offer, which are the pristine and then obviously the black label for a card which has 4 10s. Those cards are without fail in absolutely phenomenal shape. And so that's something which draws me to them as a grading company over PSA. But there are definitely reasons why you would choose to sub with PSA as well. And especially if they're able to fix some of the problems with damage and with grades just being all over the place that they had recently, I can definitely see them having more of a resurgence in Yu-Gi-Oh again. And that pretty much does it for this video. So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. And of course, if you have any thoughts on anything I said in this video, if you think there's something that I missed out, or a point that I assessed incorrectly, or anything like that, just put it down in the comments below, and I'll always do my best to get back to everyone. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.